All right, moving on. There are some attacks which actually are not the reconnaissance attacks or buffer overflows we discussed earlier. There's a type of attack commonly referred to as malware, or sometimes collectively called viruses or rogue software. Of course, there's also what's called others say it more. Also, there are some that are described by security vendors more euphemistically as potentially unwanted applications. Such things, of course, here we do not have rogue software, because honestly, rogue software is less common abroad compared to domestic rogue software, which is most prevalent. Why? Because abroad, if you pay, they won't let you use it, whereas domestically you pay, and they still won't let you use it. So this type of rogue software feels more suited to our national conditions, because in the past, everyone liked to download software for free, and if it's free, they give it to you. Just add some tech, and it's very active. Unlike foreigners, for foreigners, many software products are considered a commodity. You pay, and then you can use it. So here, of course, so it's said. Of course, like the following types: viruses, worms, trojans. These exist everywhere as long as, honestly speaking, as long as there are computers, there will be these things. Some people collectively refer to these three as what? Viruses. In fact, you can also think of them all as virus-like entities, but if we really want to differentiate them, there are indeed slight differences. The first one, viruses. Viruses, honestly, are very ancient, also a thing from the dawn of computers. And of course, they were named viruses because, like biological viruses in reality, they must attach to a cell, right? Viruses themselves do not have reproductive capability. They simply do not have the ability to reproduce. That ability, they cannot carry out life processes. They must depend on a host cell, right, by injecting their nucleic acid into the victim cell's cytoplasm, and then using the host cell machinery to replicate, borrowing the resources of these victim cells, borrowing host cell resources to synthesize proteins, right, to replicate its nucleic acids, and then to proceed, thereby reproducing. So in this case, this type of malware is very similar to biological viruses, in that it is deployed on certain program files and then can spread and infect between computers. At that time, the virus essentially borrows the victim's computer to propagate and replicate. Some viruses may only have a minor impact, but of course some can cause damage to your software and hardware. Don't think that hardware can't be damaged. Hardware can also be affected in ways that, for example, it can do so by overclocking, right? Or by damaging the firmware, because many of our hardware components can be flashed. We can flash the BIOS or firmware. It can damage these things. As for software and documents, these honestly are child's play compared to what's worst, which is the nastiest type of malware, which is ransomware, right? Ransomware is the worst because it directly encrypts your data. After encryption, it demands you to pay some kind of cryptocurrency as ransom. Paying the ransom, honestly, they might not decrypt your data, but if you don't pay the ransom, they definitely won't decrypt it. You can only hope that someone publishes the decryption key online. That's the only hope for ransomware, where some individuals publish the decryption key, causing a massive deployment of the virus, and then effectively phishing for those who are willing to pay the ransom. They profit from those who pay. And then there's a chance that one day the decryption key leaks, potentially allowing access to be regained. Then it's possible that one day, if the decryption key is leaked, there might be a chance. But overall, like these types of viruses, they often attach to programs or files, which appear normal. But if you run them, well, sorry, you've been tricked. After being tricked, the virus will then essentially perform a series of operations behind the scenes, which ultimately cause some damage to your system. Of course, not necessarily just to the software and hardware, right? Generally speaking, viruses are attached to executable files because many executable files require certain permissions. At that time, they can exploit these permissions. Then, when a user opens this executable file, it effectively activates the virus program. This type of situation triggers the virus, which is characterized by attaching to executable files with additional program code. These executable files are typically developed using compiled languages. After compiling, they turn into machine language. Honestly, it's hard to modify after compilation, but hackers often manage to embed malicious code into a normal file, usually an executable one, and then pack the virus code with it. After packing, they recompile it, effectively adding a shell. Once encapsulated, it binds everything together and then spreads. This often requires manual intervention by the user. Such viruses, when considered alongside worms, of course, some people might say, honestly, worms can also be considered viruses, because without strict definitions, worms can act like viruses due to their ability to self-replicate and spread independently. It bundles everything together and then spreads further. In such cases, users often need to manually intervene or perform manual operations. This type is a virus. Now, the next type, worms. Of course, some people refer to them as worm viruses. Truth be told, if we say without defining them specifically, worms can also be considered viruses because this thing is similar to a virus, but the difference is it doesn't require manual execution. It spreads on its own. Worms, for instance, they do this. They can spread between computers without you needing to do anything, right? They don't require your manual action, not that you need to operate it manually. They replicate and spread by themselves. Then they automatically replicate many times over, and then automatically pass it on to others. During this process, they consume a lot of system resources and bandwidth. What exactly do these worms intend to do? Honestly, they can do a lot once you're infected. Then they will, essentially, it's up to whatever the creator of the worm wants to do. Whatever they want, they can do. After all, in the world of programmers, it's like the rules are set by them. In your world as a programmer, you tell them that 1 + 1 = 3, then 1 + 1 = 3. So here, the characteristic of these worm viruses is automatic spreading. Honestly, it's quite nasty. It's more insidious than viruses because if you don't run it, generally speaking, you won't get infected. But with worms, honestly, they can spread on their own, so the chances of getting infected are much higher. This is a worm. And there's another type, Trojans. Talking about Trojans, honestly, this thing, if you insist on binding malicious code on an executable file, then Trojans can also be considered viruses, right? So it seems that worms and Trojans actually belong to the category of viruses, but Trojans often are typically for the purpose of remote control. That is, Trojans, these Trojan horses, are just like the Trojan War, where they hid soldiers inside the Trojan horse. Just like in the story of Troy, right? They used the Trojan horse to sneak soldiers inside. And here, similarly, Trojans, on the surface, appear to be useful software, but once you actually install them, they will go on to operate in the background and then wait to receive commands from the attacker, and then, without the user's knowledge, take control of the system. What does that mean? Well, for example, say your system, for instance, will definitely have some services that need to communicate with the outside world. But many of our network protocols have reserved fields, right? Network protocols have what are called reserved fields. Why do these protocols have reserved fields? Because many protocols are developed with scalability in mind. they have some fields reserved. These fields, as of now, seem meaningless. But if a hacker, when they are creating a Trojan, takes this approach and themselves craft such a signal, saying, if your system receives a certain packet with, say, a specific reserved field inside a particular bit set to on, originally, say the reserved field, say, was originally all zeros. A few zeros, depending on the protocol, which should originally be all zeros. Later, in a certain field, they make it turn a 0 into a 1. This might at that time serve as such a signal. That is to say, originally, right, a seemingly normal packet, your system might receive a seemingly normal packet, and when we usually perform access control, it's generally based on what? You say traditionally based on IP addresses, based on ports. You say you want to go that. You say you want this. Based on what's called next generation security. Usually based on what? Based on users, based on applications. But whether it's based on protocol ports or applications, ultimately, you still need packets. The data in these packets, they certainly have underlying protocols. Within these protocols, there are always such reserved fields. So, they just send one seemingly normal request and then spice up the reserved fields so that they can activate it at any time. Activate the Trojan. So this means that Trojans enable hackers to remotely control your computer, right? Here, often they do this by adding a little something in the reserved fields of these packets. And with such a signal, they activate the Trojan. After activating the Trojan, they can perform various actions on your system based on the permissions they have obtained. Of course, not limited to stealing, modifying, or deleting files. Here, they can also use your system as a zombie machine, say, to attack others, as an attack vector against other systems. So it's not necessarily just DDoS. It could be, right, using your system as a stepping stone to attack other systems. Such Trojans, though appearing as useful software, actually serve a sinister purpose. In this place, and it's just that these Trojans, usually, once you run them, they persist in the background, waiting without the user knowing, after being run, essentially remain active in the background waiting for the next command. At that time, generally, they themselves do not replicate and spread. Generally speaking, of course, you say this. If you made a Trojan and then shared this Trojan-infected software with others, then in that way, you could also be spreading it. Such Trojans characteristically, we usually say our network communications have outbound, and inbound traffic. Usually outbound traffic is not greatly restricted, but inbound traffic is often strictly controlled. At this time, the Trojan makes use of this characteristic. It causes the infected host, the host that has been implanted with the Trojan, to actively connect to the hacker, thereby bypassing some security measures. Bypassing some security controls. Normally, traffic from outside to inside is easier to defend against. But if you initiate from inside to outside, these communications are usually not as restricted. And regarding these reserved fields, right? In most network products, they are meaningless. At this time, often what happens is they manipulate these reserved fields. Of course, we have ways to defend against this. We can configure some settings on our firewalls, telling them to adhere to certain protocol standards. What does standardization mean? Your reserved fields should be all zeros. If they're not all zeros, how should they be handled? Should they be set to 0? Or should the packet be discarded or ignored? We can indeed set up defenses accordingly. This is true for viruses, worms, and Trojans, collectively known as malware. The next topic is advanced persistent threats. APTs. In these cases, we can only say that hackers come prepared, not randomly striking, but well-trained and well-prepared. Here, they target a specific objective and use sustained penetration techniques with the ultimate goal of possibly stealing information or causing disruption. This process is step by step, starting with initial penetration. Initially, this might just involve some initial probing. For example, using an account from a vendor or partner to first connect to your internal network. Once inside, they can start to scan the network and maybe use some custom tools to identify vulnerabilities in your network, such as zero-day vulnerabilities. If they find a vulnerable host, they can implant malicious code or malware on it, such as exploiting a server with a vulnerability like a buffer overflow. They could use the buffer overflow mechanism to inject malicious code into the system's memory, thereby establishing a foothold, such as planting a Trojan, and then using other methods to escalate privileges, exploiting the memory overflow to inject the malicious code into the system memory, thus planting seeds such as a Trojan, and then using other methods to try to elevate privileges. What are these methods? How do you elevate privileges, for example? By using various methods like password attacks or man-in-the-middle attacks, he can intercept passwords or attempt to crack them, using password attacks to try to break into some systems. After implanting the Trojan, he can further implant malware to let embed that further malware inside through that internal employee, for example, to run the software. In this way, especially some software that when you run it, especially when everyone runs the software, like there's an icon here, for example, with lots of icons, and there's a shield, right? It's like that. I remember it being like that, right? There's a shield, and this type with a shield often means it needs administrator rights, which is something to be particularly cautious about. Running this kind of software means it has admin privileges. If it's malicious software, then effectively it has all the permissions it needs. So this means that this type of advanced persistent threat, APT, starts with initial penetration and then establishes a foothold, injects malicious code, and then tries to elevate privileges. Then it further conducts activities, spreading laterally, etc. And eventually, it locates critical data that it can steal. Some information, and of course, he will use covert methods to send these data to the attacker. This entire process might take a long time, but it's like similar to guerrilla warfare. If you think about the previous operations like scouting attacks to see which person or system is an easy target, then they attack. This type of persistent attack is more like trench warfare, honestly. Its threat is quite significant because it's constantly fixated on you, right? It's like they've targeted you, which makes one feel very uneasy. So this type of persistent strategic attack, to be honest, it's like they've got their eye on you, and that's a troubling feeling. So these types of strategic attacks are quite alarming. Still, they're still quite newsworthy. So how do we solve this? There are solutions, right? Like sandboxes. You construct a virtual operating environment to monitor, build a virtual operating environment, meaning you create a virtual operating environment like a system. Then we can monitor some program behaviors. At such times, it's very through monitoring behavior that we can determine whether a software is functioning normally. Right? For instance, if a software is constantly scanning your hard drive, that definitely looks abnormal, right? Or if it's just a simple application that goes on to modify registry entries it shouldn't, or delete other files, or creates new files in sensitive locations and so on and so forth, or tries to access unusual URLs, then through these actions, we can judge whether the software is malicious. Is the software malicious? At such times, what does it mean? We use the sandbox for what? To test for poison, right? Before we use the software, we test it in a sandbox to see if there are any issues. At that time, if we don't know the characteristics of the software, we can still attempt to defend against it. In such cases, using a sandbox allows us to defend against these advanced persistent attacks. Of course, there are other methods like honeypots and such. Overall, defending against these premeditated, advanced persistent intrusion attacks, right, can be done in various ways. Like, for instance, we can use a fake database to trick them, let them target and steal from a decoy database. Or even more deviously, you could plant ransomware in some files, then if they steal your files, you end up locking their computer. This approach is somewhat unethical, but it has been done before. Someone once did this, planting ransomware in files and then locking the thief's computer. In files, embedding ransomware. However, whether it was successful, I don't know the outcome. Such actions are a bit underhanded but have indeed been executed in the past. Previously, someone said they previously did this, which involved planting ransomware in files. They embedded ransomware, but whether it was effective, I'm not sure. But in any case, a hacker wouldn't likely admit to being infected by such. Anyway, if a hacker gets infected, they probably won't tell others. So the effectiveness of such a strategy remains unknown. But regardless, we can use various methods to address these advanced persistent threats. Honestly, how effective they are, we don't know, but certainly, we can try different techniques to counter these attacks, not limited to sandboxes or honeypots, but also including other types of traps. Of course, fortifying our systems or networks is essential, regardless of the type of attack. Strengthening our systems and networks is always necessary. So, another thing to mention is that one of our key objectives in implementing security measures is to prevent data breaches. Protection against data breaches, in terms of how to prevent them, truth be told, involves many various steps to handle, such as email attachments, you say, anyone within the company network. For example, can send them out as an email, you say this, can you prevent it? In this case, we can deploy some email security devices to inspect our emails. Then, of course, there are some cases where if someone uses some unencrypted devices to communicate, can you allow it? Like, for instance, HTTP, not HTTPS. The difference between HTTP and HTTPS is that the former is unencrypted, while the latter is encrypted. If you use the unencrypted protocol, it's very likely that data will be exposed. So what should we do? Use encrypted methods for communication as much as possible. Of course, can cloud storage be leaked? Honestly, it's not guaranteed to be safe. So we should, as much as possible, keep sensitive or important data locally. Don't just think that it's safe. Therefore, like, for example, the data we store on public cloud services might not necessarily be secure. You can't necessarily guarantee its privacy. So, in that case, if the data is very important, we definitely keep it locally. You shouldn't be lazy about securing very important data, extremely some kinds of sensitive information. This so-called sensitive information does not necessarily refer to national secrets. It could be corporate or personal secrets. Certain data that you feel is important to keep private or is particularly significant, we try to store locally as much as possible. As for devices like USB drives and portable hard drives, how do we protect against them? For instance, we can use something like Bitroot. Our systems, for example, will have this capability. In our system will have such a feature. I remember systems always have characters. Not all have characters, only the higher end versions, like the Pro version of the system. The Home version probably doesn't have it, but the Pro and Enterprise versions will have this feature, this Bitroot software. This software can encrypt our hard drives and also our USB and external drives. Of course, you say, if you want to prevent someone from copying data from your system using these drives, the information in your computer. Honestly, you have to protect against a lot. Why? If you say, for instance, you disable USB ports, those kinds of portable storage devices, what good does it do if I disable the USB? It's useless because someone could still boot your computer with a startup disk, right? But you say, no worries, if you have your hard drive encrypted with BitLocker, then that's also a solution. Or what else? In case of such a scenario, if an employee for some personal gain wants to steal company data, how do you prevent that? His own computer naturally allows him to connect his drive. At that time, of course, some security vendors offer specific software that works by embedding what appears to be gibberish into your files. This mechanism works such that on your say, when it's triggered by it, essentially inserts into your files insertions that seem like gibberish. Some content that effectively means if you have the corresponding application installed on your computer, you can access the original file information. But if you leave a system that has this application installed, once opened, it appears as gibberish. This software also exists, and in some ways, it can also protect against threats from USB drives and external hard drives. If you just consider from the perspective of file security, it's hard to defend against, you say, won't they use a boot disk anyway? You say, just focusing on files doesn't really protect them, you say, right? If you disable the USB, won't they just use a boot disk, you say? You say you could just use a glue gun and seal the USB port, right? But couldn't someone just connect directly to your motherboard? Wouldn't they just plug into your motherboard? Right, then you say, oh, I could cut off the pins on the motherboard, but honestly, playing it that way isn't really practical. Playing like that, no worries, he says. They could still use a PCI slot, right? Honestly, trying to solve it with such low-tech methods is difficult, but there are some software solutions or systems that can insert seemingly meaningless fields into your files, making the files unreadable once they leave that system. This is also an option, of course. After all this talk, what if an employee wants to steal company data for personal gain? How do you prevent that? They could simply use their device to plug in a disk. At that point, some security vendors offer software that can interfere with file readability outside their system. After so much discussion, what if an employee can't physically remove the data? Can't they just bring a camera, point it at the screen, and take photos or record videos? In such cases, you can only really rely on your company policies to manage this. Honestly, if there's a real insider threat, it's up to your policies to withstand such tests. Besides, for data leak prevention, another aspect is access control. This is usually implemented within our network by deploying access control policies on our network devices to block unauthorized users from accessing data. Essentially, only authorized individuals should have access to internal data, ensuring that irrelevant personnel are strictly forbidden access. From a network perspective, this approach is straightforward and brutal, reflecting one of the most common practices in network security: access control. Of course, within access control, we aim to block unauthorized personnel from accessing sensitive data. Essentially, the elements involved include the user and the data they are attempting to access, which are resources within our network. Here, we must authenticate users, knowing who they are and their credentials before allowing any operations. Similarly, in access control, the focus is on protecting network resources, essentially what most of our network security efforts are geared towards. Preventing unauthorized access to data means considering both the personnel and the data they access, or the resources in our network. Here, we assess the user to certify. Only after knowing who the user is and verifying their identity can we proceed with the appropriate actions, right? Likewise, our focus in access control is to safeguard the resources within our network. So, what constitutes resources in our network? It's anything that can be accessed. Often, data needs to be accessed, so this data is also a resource within our network that we can protect through access control. This might sound abstract, but honestly, we will introduce some security technologies and discuss how we can use them to provide protection, including some devices we might encounter. When we talk about these technologies, we will come back to how we can use them to achieve specific functions and protections. Next, we'll discuss hacker tools. Hacker tools, as opposed to the security tools and network troubleshooting tools we talked about earlier, differ primarily in the intent and motive of the user. Common tools, like secure tools, a website page that acts as a repository where you can find a plethora of security tools, even includes rankings and reviews. It's like an app store for security tools. There, you can find a ton of tools or directly download a web page that provides you with a multitude of tools, some even packaged into a Linux system as a hacker's toolkit, giving the feeling of an app store. There, you can download a variety of tools packaged together, which are then deployed within a Linux system, forming a comprehensive hacker toolkit. Many of these software tools can also be used for conducting security tests or as part of a security toolkit. These tools, while designed for penetration testing, can be used to test our own network defenses by simulating attacks. They allow us to scan and fortify our own networks. For example, tools like Wireshark should not be overlooked, as hackers also use it to capture packets, which we use for educational purposes to learn about network traffic. Hackers can use it to capture packets and analyze your network to plan their next moves. They can use captured packet data to analyze your network and strategize their subsequent attacks. If your network is lax in security, especially if data is sent unencrypted, they can easily intercept it using Wireshark. Wireshark is commonly used in conjunction with man-in-the-middle attacks to intercept and capture data, which is then analyzed. This data is freely handed to them, and Wireshark often works with man-in-the-middle attacks to achieve this. Together, use them. That is, first, the attacker performs a man-in-the-middle attack, hijacking your traffic. Then, he can use something like Wireshark to capture packets, and then he can analyze your data. The following two, one is Nmap, which is a scanning tool. This tool can be used for penetration testing and is often built into our security platforms. So these tools are not necessarily hacker tools or strictly security tools. Okay, as for this next one, Metasploit. It is an open source software also used for penetration testing. It can primarily be used to check if your host is online. It can scan a batch of hosts to see if they are online and what services you are providing. Then, based on the services provided, it can deduce what system you are using. In fact, different systems, not just the services and ports they use, differ, but sometimes even details like TTL values. For instance, some systems send packets with a TTL of 255, others might use 64, and so on. These details help infer which operating system you might be using. So, this section includes various penetration and packet capturing tools, as well as a packed toolkit for hackers, or if you're not satisfied, you can find more in certain communities. This means here we have some penetration tools, packet capturing tools, and even a complete hacker toolkit available. If you want more, you can look for them in certain communities. These tools are not to say that everyone should go and play with them. You should not use them for illegal activities. Otherwise, if you get into trouble, don't blame me. Alright, these are the hacker tools, okay? Now let's talk about some common misconceptions. Okay, next, let's discuss some common misconceptions.